I'm going to have Seth Denson on with me in just a second. He is with GDP Advisors. He's a guy that knows all about not just the healthcare industry, but how it relates politically to this particular instance. This looks like a fight that probably the Republicans, and in particular the president, should not want to take on. The toothpaste, as they say, is out of the tube, and the key to me seems to be fixing the Affordable Care Act and not necessarily completely replacing it, because I don't think he's got the votes. And I'm not sure that the court is going to come in his favor, too, on this thing. In fact, if I had to lay money right now, even with the current composition of the Supreme Court, I don't see it happening. I don't see it happening. But as I mentioned, Seth Denson is the founder and president of GDP Advisors. And their mission basically is to take what the healthcare industry is right now, as complicated as it is, and try somehow, some way to make it understandable to you, me, and all of us. So I wanted to bring Seth on today. We have tracked him down to the Texas Motor Speedway, where he apparently is soaking up everything NASCAR this weekend. I had no idea this dude was a NASCAR fan, but he's taken time away. He's taken time away from the family trailer to join us here on 700 WLW and the AcuteHearingCenters.com hotline. I had no idea you were this NASCAR buff, that you were so soaked into this stuff. Seth, first of all, thank you for joining us. Second of all, I hope you get to drive today. And third of all, I hope you're having a great time down there deep in the heart of Texas.
Well, Ken, it's funny. So last weekend, I actually got to do what's called the NASCAR experience. My wife, for Christmas, had gotten me a day at the track where I got to drive a NASCAR around the track, and it was a great time. My father-in-law came out, and he got to do it as well. We had a great time with it.
Good for you. That sounds like a blast. Okay, so this district judge down in Texas has declared that the entire Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, should be booted, because the mandate to buy into it has been declared now unconstitutional. So the whole thing should be declared unconstitutional. And his decision will wind up, I'm sure, in the Fifth Circuit down in New Orleans, and then ultimately the Supreme Court. It may be a while before it navigates its way through all of that. In the meantime, I think, Seth, everybody remains where they are right now. But what happens if indeed that this challenge in your state, in Texas, is deemed to be legal by the Supreme Court? All hell would break loose at that point, would it not?
It would. I mean, so let's think back, though. So this will be, if it makes it to the Supreme Court, and I firmly believe that it will, this will be the third time that the Supreme Court has taken up the Affordable Care Act. And if you'll remember, as most conservatives do, their general frustration with Justice Roberts, who ultimately sided with the more left-leaning side of the court and found the Affordable Care Act constitutional, with Kennedy, who everybody, I think, thought was going to go that way, ultimately not. Now we have two new Supreme Court justices that have not heard the Affordable Care Act in Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. But that said, Justice Roberts was a swing vote then. He could still be here now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, Ken, because if this does get overturned, I want to reassure any of your listeners that are getting advantages from the Affordable Care Act. It took 4 to 5 years to roll this thing out. Mm-hmm. The markets had to adjust, new plans had to come in place, and it'll take likely similar to that amount of time to unroll the Affordable Care Act. As my daddy always says, it's hard to put toothpaste back in tubes. Yeah. And when once you put something out there, things like no pre-existing conditions and guarantee issuances of coverage, all of these things, it's going to be hard to unwind that. And most Republicans have come out and said, if this does get overturned, whatever comes into play later will include a lot of the provisions of the ACA.
So if your timeline is correct, it's not necessary, Trump could come out and say, which he has, that he wants the whole thing overturned, and he wants the Republicans to be the party of great health care. Okay, I got that. But if your timeline is correct, and it's the same timeline that we saw the last time that this was challenged, that the Republicans wouldn't necessarily have to have a replace plan in place by the 2020 election, but probably politically it would behoove them to do that. I would think they need to get busy between now and 2020.
Yeah, I was actually on Fox a couple of days ago talking about this, and my commentary to them was that the Republicans have got to stop talking about the Affordable Care Act and instead pivot to real solutions. You know, the Republicans had the chance to do something substantial right after President Trump won the election, and they controlled both houses of Congress. Unfortunately, they couldn't come together to do it because you had certain parts of the various caucuses wanting something.
Right.
And instead of coming together and saying, hey, we may not get everything, but let's get something, they couldn't do that. And that was really disappointing for those that thought that this could be a chance for Republicans to step up and do something about health care. I heard President Trump say just last week, right, that the Republicans would be the party of health care. But I want to see action. And, the thing is, Ken, there's so many things that Republicans can do. The ACA, where it failed was it primarily focused on the insurance markets only. Well, that's like me saying, hey, I know you have a spending problem, so I'm going to lower your credit card interest. That doesn't change your spending habits. It doesn't change your spending problem. It just lowers the interest rate.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what the Affordable Care Act is. Because I know we have a health care cost problem, but we're just going to impact the insurance market. It just doesn't work. You need to start focusing on things that the Trump administration is doing, and they've been pushing for, things like transparency and lower prescription drug costs. We need a fair and transparent market so that the consumer can be a consumer. And in a free market system, the consumer has the power. But in healthcare in the United States, transparency isn't there, and the consumer just doesn't have the power.
Seth Denson's our guest. He is the co-founder and the guy that's the guru, the president of a company called GDP Advisors. You and I had a conversation, I want to say maybe 2-3 months ago, when it looked like there would be more transparency with the way you would be treated if you went into a hospital, transparency in the way things would be charged, how much you would need to go in to have an operation done, what your medical costs post-operative would be, particularly for pharmaceuticals. And there seemed to have been steps, but it was so coated up, it was so shrouded in hospital insurance ease that you really couldn't get to the bottom of what all of that is. Is it getting any clearer now for somebody, anybody listening today? They know that they're going to have some sort of medical procedure done in the next week or two. Is there anything that is clearer to them today than what it was a couple of months ago?
A little bit. It's a slow-moving thing, right? It's like I always call it, it's crawl, walk, then run, and this was a first step. We are starting to see in the marketplace hospital systems, which under the Trump administration now are required to publish what's called their charge master. This is kind of their secretive list of how they charge for everything. Mm-hmm. And they now have to make those public, although, as you just alluded to, it's coded in a way that the average American couldn't just jump up there and say, hey, I need a knee scope. What is that going to cost me?
Right.
But that said, there are those that understand the coding system that are finding ways to capitalize on this and create these algorithms to read these things so that the consumer can use this. As a result, what we are studying and what we are seeing at GDP Advisors is a lot of these hospitals that were charging ridiculous rates for certain things are now starting to bring them down because now it can be transparent, and they don't want to be seen. I'll give you an example. In Florida not long ago, may have seen it in the news, a woman got bit by a feral cat trying to feed it and ended up needing to get rabies shots. Well, those rabies shots ended up costing the poor woman $48,000 because this hospital charged $7,000 a vial. Today, now that there's transparency, that hospital has reduced the cost of per vial somewhere in the range of $2,000 because now people know and now people can see that cost. And so that's part of it. It's going to take some time. Now, what I would tell your listeners to do is be diligent on the front end. Don't try to be reactive. Be proactive when it comes to healthcare. And what I mean by that is if you're told by somebody in a lab coat you need to get something done, ask questions. Ask what's this going to cost me. Call the hospital. Ask for what's called a predetermination of cost. And ask for a detailed list. It's not a guarantee, but it does give you an idea of what the bill is going to look like.
We can only guess what the Supreme Court makeup will look like when this eventually makes its way to them. Right now, there's a decided majority for the conservatives, but Roberts, as you said, was the wild card in 2012. I'm wondering, as we look down the road, and here we are sitting in 2019, as we look down the road 5 years from now, in your opinion, will the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, still be in its present state, or will the Republicans, either if they regain the House or if they continue to hold the Senate and the White House, Will they then have their own health care plan in place, knowing full well they had 2 years to do that at one point and couldn't get out of their own way? Look down the road in 5 years and tell me what health care in this country will look like.
Yeah, so part one of that, the Supreme Court, after the last ruling, I feel that I don't know that there's merit out of this case out of Texas to get it overturned in the courts. I really don't. I think that the premise that Judge O'Connor here in Texas ruled as unconstitutional under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and we can talk about that. That's kind of an interesting way that he looked at the law. But the way that he structured it, I just don't think the Supreme Court overrules or overturns the Affordable Care Act as a result. So I think the Affordable Care Act is here. But I'll tell you, and listen, I'm saying this as a conservative, the Republicans do not want the Affordable Care Act overturned. I know that flies in the face of what everybody seems to think they want. Yeah. I'm telling you they don't, because they don't have a plan, nor do they have control of the House of Representatives. And you got to understand, if this gets overturned, it is a gift to the Democrats, because Nancy Pelosi can say, hey, we're not going to work with you. You've now made this mess and you own it. Yep. And no matter how it slices and dices, the American public will look at this being overturned, if it happens, as the Republicans' fault. And 32 million people who are getting benefits from the Affordable Care Act are going to look at this as the Republicans' fault. The Democrats aren't going to work with us. Mm-hmm. So what you've got to do is fix the Affordable Care Act. These are things it can do, because the Affordable Care Act is imploding on its own, and therefore that generally brings an opportunity for it to be fixed. You can keep the same structure of the Affordable Care Act, because the Trump administration, through executive order, has actually taken out a lot of the things that we didn't like anyway.
Yeah.
And then to go about your plan as Republicans of saying we're going to bring down the cost of health care. If we can bring down the cost of health care, the Affordable Care Act can work with that, and we can actually have a system where the consumer has the power. That is the key to our system, not Medicare for all, not a free-for-all, where the consumer has the ability to navigate the markets appropriately.
Seth Denson, I've just been handed this in the last 25 seconds. You may be interested in this. Kyle Busch apparently is ill today, and they're looking for someone to replace him in his ride. If you're interested, I have a phone number for you to call.
My goodness, buddy, I'm here. Kyle's a little taller than me. They have to adjust that seat down a little bit. I wish I was that tall. I'm not, but I could make it work.
Seth Denson, thank you so much for your time today on 700 WLW.
Kid, always good to be with you. Have a great day.
Yeah, in June, the Trump administration lawyers stopped defending key parts of the law, including its guaranteed access to health insurance for people with pre-existing medical conditions. But this week, the president backed off on that. In his speech in Grand Rapids, he said they want to honor pre-existing conditions. I just don't sense that anybody that wants this thing overturned has an idea of what will happen when it is overturned, or what the next best idea is. And wasn't that the problem a couple of years ago? So I don't know if this is a fight that they really want to take on. And frankly, even if it does get through the House and to the Senate, I don't know if he's got the votes. I mean, you look at some of those people in the Senate, you have no idea. Republicans, you have no idea which way they're going to vote, particularly when it comes to this. It's coming up on 1224 News Radio 700 WLW.